the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Learning How to Learn by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Learning How to Learn. 100 Conversations with Idries Shah. Condensed from over 3 million words, these conversations answer questions prompted by Shah's 16 books, his university lectures, and radio and television programs. He answers housewives and cabinet ministers, philosophy professors and assembly line workers, on the subjects of how traditional psychology can illuminate current human, social and spiritual problems. More than 100 tales and extracts, ranging from the 8th century Hassan of Basra to today's Ustad Khalilullah Khalili, are woven into Shah's narratives of how and why the Sufis learn, what they learn, and how spiritual understanding may be developed, as well as how it inevitably deteriorates in all societies. Shah draws on over 70,000 questions from Afghanistan and California, Delhi and Strasbourg, quotes Eastern parables of Jesus, the ancient classics of the Sufis, contemporary encounters with teachers and students, the Mullah Nasruddin teaching figure, Omar Khayyam, and Western mass circulation journals. Many of the concepts which Shah has introduced, including the vital role of the right time, place, and company of higher studies, the very concept of learning how to learn, and the instrumental, specialized function of ordinarily automatically performed exercises and rituals, have recently been widely copied by psychologists and gurus alike. This book contains the real material, however, on these and dozens of other subjects. Note, some of the conversations contain more than one question. Other conversations did not arise through questions. As a result, the 100 conversations are not to be calculated as 100 questions and answers. Take warning from the misfortunes of others, so that others need not have to take warning from your own. Sadi, Rose Garden, 13th century. When the camel of our efforts sinks into the mud, what matter whether the destination is near or far? Ustad Khalilullah Khalili, Quatrains, 1975. The world has no being but an allegory. From end to end, its state is but a farce and play. Shabastari, Secret Garden, 13th century. Introduction. Beginning to Begin by Idries Shah. Until only a few years ago, as literary people, psychologists and the increasing number of those engaged in studying human consciousness now so often remind us, Sufism was a closed book for the ordinary person. Its language, in the form found in its classical and technical writings, seemed almost impenetrable. Orientalists, now more correctly renamed specialists in the human sciences in Asia and Africa, maintained a near monopoly of information on the subject, and yet could be found extensively disagreeing as to what Sufism was, how and where it started, and what its teachings meant. Some Islamic workers were against it, others claimed it as the true essence of Islam. Some non-Muslim observers were powerfully attracted to it, others found it too culture-bound for their liking. The publication of Sufi stories stripped of didactic overlay and much verbiage, together with studies of Sufi psychological work and, perhaps, above all, the observed analogies with current social and cultural concerns, has changed this picture quite dramatically. It is now generally accepted that Sufi research and experience during the past 1,000 years has been one of the most promising areas of development in the direction of understanding man and indicating his perceptions of extra-dimensional reality. But it was not until people, mainly in the West, began to note the congruence of religious and psychological, esoteric and cultural thinking that a more holistic approach to the subject could develop. Meanwhile, of course, laggards in science still regard Sufism as mysterious esotericism. Cultists still want to preserve this aura. A few scholars wish to produce a monopoly by claiming that their interpretations alone are authoritative, the latter sometimes presenting a spectacle resembling that of the alchemist opposing chemistry because he does not understand it. The work of displaying the many-sidedness and current relevance of Sufism has not been difficult, given two prerequisites: freedom to publish and a growing dissatisfaction in many cultures with hidebound and ignorant authority. All that has been needed has been to quote from legitimate Sufi sources, including documents, teachings which show the scientific as well as the religious interest, to demonstrate from the same sources that the psychological insights of the Sufis have proved a source of continuing knowledge which is not inferior to the achievements of the modern workers in the field of the mind. In addition, the discovery of the Sufis by several such workers of undeniable importance, and the existence of a living Sufi tradition, aside from repetitious cultism and the other deteriorated elements, made it rapidly possible, within the span of a decade, for several workers to provide materials which have verified much of the true nature of the Sufi heritage, and to confirm its continuing operation. It has been objected, of course, that the popularization of Sufi materials might alienate many people from the ancient traditions and values which it is held by some to represent. In actual fact, the reverse has been true. In one publication after another, even traditionalist and formal scholars, as well as many others in East and West, have eagerly accepted the recent reclaiming of the meaning of the materials, and the number of people interested has enormously increased. To disdain these newcomers because they are not always professional Orientalists or cultists, still too many people are both, is to fail to observe that many of them are at least as intelligent, well-informed, and potentially useful in human research as the specialists. One of the saddest things, in fact, about the reaction in some quarters against the revelation of fresh insights into the essential Sufism has been the displaying of almost primitive and quite stupefying bigotry and small-mindedness in circles where these characteristics are prejudicial to the honor of the learned calling and dangerous to the likelihood that such people will continue to be taken seriously by those whose respect means so much to them. In brief, Sufism has arrived in the minds of people in the more flexible and increasingly interesting areas of contemporary thought. It has also become a part of the experience and interest of some of today's more distinguished people throughout the world. It is operating widely, in cross-disciplinary and general areas, as a factor whose value and contribution can neither be denied nor arrested. What has happened is that more people are prepared to study perennial truth apart from local manifestations and derivative sociological forms of mainly anthropological value. Traditionally, Sufi understanding has relied heavily upon question and answer. The following pages, extracted to give a cross-section of materials elicited during hundreds of hours of talks, relate to many of the subjects which interest such a very large number of people today. The 100 conversations also represent answers to questions which have been asked again and again in a postbag of more than 40,000 letters from all over the world. In spite of the enormous demand for Sufi thought to be presented only in terms of familiar attitudes and local cultural expression, it would be unfair, both to the Sufis and to those who might learn from them, to attempt putting this quart into a pint pot. Sufi thought and action requires its own formats in which to manifest and operate. It is for this reason that it has always, in the past and in its several areas of expression, established and maintained its own institutions and teaching centers. But the modern Western atmosphere, however much it may have neglected to develop such formats for itself, is nowadays much more than formally prepared to accept the hypothesis that there might be a form of learning which is presented, concentrated and disseminated through characteristic and specialized institutions, It is only where we get people imagining that the outward form of such institutions, suited to one place or age, is both suitable for here and now, and also representative of the thing itself, that the onus is on us to point out the fact that such opinions are limited and limiting. They disable those who hold them from understanding in the same way that the yokel in the Sufi tale could not benefit from his bowl of liquid soup because all soup has lumps in it. There was once a man who opened a restaurant with a good kitchen, attractive tables, and an excellent menu. One of his friends came along soon afterwards and said, "Why have you not got a sign like all the other eating places? I suggest that you put on it, 'Restaurant, finest food.'" When the sign was painted and put up, another enquirer asked, "You have to be more specific. You might mean any old restaurant. Add the words 'served here' and your sign will be complete." The owner thought that this was a good idea, and he had the signboard duly altered. Not long afterwards, someone else came along and said, "Why do you put 'here'? Surely anyone can see where the place is." So the restaurateur had the sign changed. Presently, a further curious member of the public wanted to know, "Do you not know that the word 'served' is redundant? All restaurants and shops serve. Why not take it out?" So that word was taken out. Now another visitor said, "If you continue to use the phrase 'finest food,' some people will be sure to wonder whether it really is the finest, and some will not agree. To guard against criticism and contention, please do remove the word 'finest.'" And so he did. Now just the word "food" was to be seen on the notice, and a sixth inquisitive individual put his head through the doorway. "Why have you got the word 'food' on your restaurant? Anyone can see that you serve food here." So the restaurateur took down the sign. As he did so, he could not help wondering when somebody who was hungry, rather than curious or intellectual, would come along. In this tale, of course, the restaurateur is plagued by the literal mindedness of the people of reason, for whom, as for all of us, intellect plays a valuable part. The food which our man is trying to provide, however, is the food of the heart, where the heart stands in Sufi parlance for the higher perceptive faculties of humankind. Our contemporary Sufi poet, Professor Khalilullah Khalili, my most illustrious compatriot, puts it like this: "In every state, the heart is my support. In this kingdom of existence, it is my sovereign. When I tire of the treachery of reason, God knows I am grateful to my heart." Idries Shah, 1978. Part 1. Real and Imagined Study. Sufis and their Imitators. Question: what can you do about imitators? It has been observed that, since you started to make Sufism known really widely in the West, numerous small groups have been enlarged, and entirely new ones have sprung up, and most people realize that these are just cults, and not Sufi groups at all. The Small Boy and the Examination. Answer: that reminds me of a joke. It is said that a small boy was faced with an examination question. What is rabies, and what can you do about it? He wrote as his answer, "Rabies is Jewish priests, and there is nothing you can do about it." These Sufis are Sufists, not Sufis, and there is nothing that you can do about it. I am, however, interested in an inherent assumption, the one behind the question, that one should either have anything to do about it, or that one could, indeed, do anything about it. If we try to do anything about it, we risk attracting large numbers of disenchanted former Sufists, who would hope at first that we could give them the real thing, but who would become doubly homeless, so to speak, when they found that one branch of the entertainment industry had closed down and another failed to open up. Sufi studies in the West and in the contemporary East, it should be remembered, are repeating a pattern. Not only do humorous tales contain valuable structures for understanding, their use also helps to weed out people who lack a sense of humor. Sufis hold that people who have not developed or who have suppressed their capacity to enjoy humor are, in this deprived state, also without learning capacity in the Sufi sphere. Throughout the ages there have been Sufis and imitators. Perhaps to clarify things in your own mind, you might like to ask yourself this question. Why do I imagine that there is any activity that does not have imitators, charlatans, confusion, and tourists and passengers? People do not find that they can do anything about tricksters or cranks who offer a trip to the moon, except to increase public information on spaceflight. I cannot help feeling that the questioner is defining his own mentality and showing us that he is thinking in a more confined way than his limitations require. If we can do anything about the imitation, it is to spread the information of the real. But our doing this depends upon the audience being prepared. The preparation involves a wideness of horizon and the intelligent use of the clear-thinking methods which are already current in all present-day societies, though only lately coming into use in our area of interest. The negative attitude is to look at the imitators. The positive one, surely, is to remember the words of Jalaluddin Rumi, who said that false gold only exists because there is such a thing as the real. Jami and the externals. Both imitators and the followers of previous formulations, whose externals alone persist, can be reminded, especially if they read the Sufi classics, that externals are not the same as content. It is in this vein that the great teacher Jami speaks in his Baharistan, the abode of spring. The rose is gone from the garden. What can I do with the thorns and leaves? The Shah is not in the city. What shall I do with his court? The attractions are the cage, beauty and goodness the parrot. When the parrot has flown, what can I do with the cage? Analogy of the fur jacket. In Fihi Ma Fihi we find the allegory of the jacket. In winter, says Rumi, you look for a fur garment, but when summer comes you have no time for it. It is an encumbrance. So it is with imitations of real teachings. They keep people warmed until the time comes when they can be warmed by the sun. So, like the fur garment, people will cleave to cults and imitations because these things suit them, respond to something within them which calls for cults and imitations. At the same time, of course, they imagine all sorts of things about themselves, such as that they are genuine, sincere, unconcerned about themselves and concerned about others or about truth. Shibli and the Stones. In a famous instance, recorded for instance in the Ilahi Nama of Hakim Sanai, the Sufi teacher Shibli of Khorasan made this self-deception a matter of illustration teaching in a dramatic event which he initiated. Because of his extravagant utterances, disliked by the authorities, Shibli was chained up as a madman. A number of people who respected him went to him on a visit, inquiring about his welfare. He asked them who they considered themselves to be, and they answered that they were his friends. At this, Shibli hurled stones at them, and they ran away. Shibli shouted, "You say that you are my friends, thinking of me, but I have shown you that you flee from my affliction, and hence you are concerned not for me, but for your own protection from stones." To receive what is not your destiny. Besides, we should bear in mind the teaching of the great sage Abul Hasan Kirkani, recorded in Attar's Recitals of the Saints. The people of the world have a fixed destiny, but the spiritually developed receive what is not in their destiny. Question: what is the harm in imitating? I am sure that most, if not all, of the human development systems which are publicly offered are only imitations. If, however, these give people pleasure and some taste of a deeper reality, they surely must have a value. The knots standing in the way of the textiles. If you take an analogy, you might see it differently. Supposing we were discussing the art of weaving which might be developed. Supposing people were at a stage where they could only tie knots in string, which gave them pleasure and might be regarded as a foretaste of weaving. If the people only imitated the knotting phase, and in addition regarded the knotting as the entire art, when would weaving itself come into being, no matter how much pleasure there was attached to it? Certainly, knotting would have a value as such, but it would also constitute a barrier to going further, if the idea of anything further were abolished, by people thinking that knots were as far as anyone could go in textile work. There are 2 points worth noting here. The first is that pleasure certainly is not to be opposed, but there are many sources of pleasure, and to seek pleasure as a part of something more specific leads to confusion and more. The second is that if you get obsessed by the early stages of something, imagining it to be the whole, you will not go further. The woman and the spiritual being. Look at the ancient tale of the woman and the spiritual being. There was once a poor woman who helped a spiritual being disguised as a wanderer from far away, giving him hospitality when others had cast him out. As he left her house, he said, "May your first task tomorrow last all day." She thought that this was a strange way of thanking someone, but soon forgot. The following day, a merchant brought her a short length of gold thread and asked her to embroider it onto a garment, for embroidery was her work when she could get any. She unwound the gold and embroidered the cloth. When she had finished, she saw that there was more gold thread on the floor than she had started out with. The more she wound it up into a ball, the more there was. She wound gold thread all day, and by nightfall she had an enormous quantity. By tradition, leftover thread belonged to the embroideress. She sold this thread, and with the money she was able to rebuild her house and furnish it, as well as set herself up with a fine shop. Naturally, the neighbors became curious, and she told them how her luck had changed and what had caused it. Some time later, a merchant in the same town saw and recognized the stranger with magical powers from what the woman had said about him, and invited him into his shop and home. He showed the spiritual being great hospitality, imitating the way in which open-handed people behave, even carrying his attentiveness to extremes. He thought, there must be something in this for me, and of course for everyone in this town. He added the second phrase to his thoughts because, although greedy, he imagined that just to think of others would get him something for himself. Because, however, he was imitating charity, and because he did not think of the good of others equally with his own good, but only as an afterthought, things turned out differently for him than for the charitable woman. When the stranger was about to leave, the merchant said, "Give me a blessing." "I do not do that," said the stranger, "but I wish that your first concern today should endure for a week." He went on his way, and the merchant set off for his counting house, where he proposed to count money, multiplying it for a whole week. On the way across his own courtyard, the merchant stopped for a drink of water at his well. No sooner had he pulled up one bucketful than he found himself compelled to draw another, and this went on for an entire week. The water flooded his house, then that of the neighbors, and finally the whole town, almost causing it to collapse. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.